Thank you, Arctic Acoustic. I love the music. Welcome back to Hanging with History. This is Season 1, That Miracle That Happened, That One Time. This is Episode 41, James I, the Mildest Monarch. And we're going to have Nightrider back on the program. Nightrider, last heard from during the Origins of Parliament episode, where we went over the madness of modus tenende parliamentum. Anyway, she knows a lot about cognitive biases and is a really deep thinker. Let's talk diplomacy. James saw himself as a master diplomat, coming very quickly to a peace with Spain. And he had modern 21st century notions that there was really nothing a good diplomat could not solve, and he himself was one of the greats. And of course, this would lead to much farce and great tragedy. Some people see the desire for peace and diplomatic solutions as one of James's most attractive qualities. But the real world is more complex and chaotic than we can ever imagine. Is it possible that too much peace, in a time when your neighbors are involved in existential strife, will build up an irresistible demand for war?
I don't know about that. It worked for Sweden and Switzerland in the 20th century, though I suppose they were just minor powers and never had war parties advocating joining the wars.
Yeah, that's one of the keys. Yeah, Sweden and Switzerland did not have a war party, as you say, and they could not realistically expect to influence the outcome. For England, peace with Spain meant abandoning the Dutch, but the Spanish were about to shoot themselves in the foot with the expulsion of the Moriscos, which caused a depression, as I've mentioned, and then sign a truce with the Dutch in exhausted frustration. Then, in 1618, the 30 Years' War would start, and like it or not, James was near the heart of it. His only surviving adult daughter, Elizabeth, married Frederick, Elector of the Palatinate, one of the few Calvinist, as opposed to Lutheran, states in Germany. The Palatinate covers both banks of the Rhine in the middle section, including Heidelberg and Dusseldorf, but at the time we're talking about also included, fatefully, many miles of territory on the western border of Bohemia. And what does that title elector mean? It means he's one of the 7 electors who elect the Holy Roman Emperor. In practice, always a Habsburg during this time, but the electors were important princes because they could, potentially, pick anyone. Well, have you heard about the defenestration of Prague?
Defenestration is a weird word. It means tossing someone out the window. In this case, representatives of the Habsburgs were thrown out of a parliament window in Prague. Supposedly, one of the outraged Protestants threw the Catholic regent out the window and said, "Let your Virgin Mary save you from that." And then they landed in a manure pile, so they did survive. Maybe the Virgin Mary saved their bodies, but certainly not their dignity.
Makes a good story anyway. Well, when the Protestant Assembly in Prague rejected the Habsburgs, they gave the crown to Elector Frederick in 1619, which kicked off the very unfun, insanely murdery 30 Years' War. Fornebu, in episode 25, mentioned that something like a third of Germans died during this war. A third. And in some areas, perhaps 60% of the population died, mainly from disease and starvation. Do you think trade was disrupted? Trade was disrupted. Frederick and Elizabeth became known as the Winter King and Queen. They lost Bohemia after the defeat at the Battle of the White Mountain in 1620, and shortly afterwards saw the Palatinate occupied by Spanish troops as well, after James commits a classic diplomatic blunder we will discuss in a bit. All this illustrates an impossible tension in James's foreign diplomacy. He cultivated a Spanish alliance, even tried to marry his son Charles into the Spanish royal house, but also had to support his daughter and the Protestant cause.
But why did he want a Catholic alliance?
That was his policy since he became King of England 15 years before. Only France and Spain could threaten England, according to the thinking of the time, and there are many, many reasons to favor peace over war with bigger, stronger powers that can potentially obliterate you. However, radical Protestants would ceaselessly urge James to take action to save the Palatinate and his niece, but James preferred to play the diplomatic game, even to zero effect. The 1621 Parliament urged action. But what England was supposed to do about faraway Bohemia, it's hard to know. It did have a coastline in the Tempest, but Not in reality. They tried to make voting tax revenue dependent on James declaring war on Spain, but James just dissolved Parliament instead. An important tidbit is that Parliament voted unanimously, voted for war with the Catholic powers, unanimously, so that tells you the political nation was all a war party. What we don't know is whether they would have voted enough money to pay for the war. They were often not really very practical in these times. Let's switch to a little bit of narrative. James had a religious conference with the bishops and some Puritan Presbyterian divines early in his reign. I've mentioned how James's upbringing, among what seems at a distance of time, pretty bigoted and narrow-minded Presbyterian ministers, although this is doubtless unfair to them, and it left him suspicious of Puritans. According to Peter Ackroyd, quote, "The king liked nothing so much as doctrinal discussion, in which he could display his learning. When he began to perceive that the Puritans were arguing for elimination of bishops and the establishment of Presbyterianism in England, he essentially told one of them that Scottish Presbyterianism agreeth with monarchy like God and the devil. It would mean Jack and Tom and Will and Dick shall meet, and at their pleasure censure me and my council and all our proceedings. Until you find I grow lazy, leave it alone." I like that. It's not an argument, but a threat, as if from a senior mafia boss to a low-level hood. The Puritans would remain quiet for a time, but it was this conference that led to the creation of the King James Bible, the fruit of joint labor by Puritans and Anglicans together, which built on Tyndale's work and eventually created what was really the definitive English Bible that replaced all the others in use at the time. Eventually, most other Bibles were not even allowed to be printed. And the Geneva Bible, my personal favorite, with its anti-authoritarian footnotes, was banned outright. Just another example of politics and religion deeply intertwined in this period. James was continually struggling to live within his means. The tradition was that the king should, quote, live of his own, unquote. In other words, he should maintain his regal estate and pay for the government out of his own resources. This included his vast lands, customs revenue, where the king had an absolute prerogative. It was universally believed that direct taxation was an extraordinary event only suitable for wartime purposes.
Wait, customs revenue would grow with trade, right? And trade would grow with peace. So the peace policy supported growing the crown revenue too.
Yes, trade more than doubled during the peace, and crown revenue alongside it. Like I said, many reasons to prefer peace. James's first parliament in 1604 sat for 5 sessions until 1611, and this 7-year term was unusual and possibly gave that parliament a corporate identity which enabled innovation. Typically, the speaker appointed by the king would call parliament together and also adjourn them from deliberations. So the speaker could control what subjects were discussed and when discussion would end. So you can see the royally appointed speaker has a great deal of power. In 1607, Parliament came up with a bright new idea. The House of Commons would declare themselves a committee of the House. A committee could appoint its own speaker, dispensing with the need for a royal speaker. This would allow them to debate as long as they wished. This is a crucial constitutional development. Think of the difference between a parliament whose topics for discussion are controlled by the crown, and whenever Parliament turns to a subject the Crown doesn't like, the Crown can simply end the discussion. Elizabeth, or should I say Cecil, managed Parliament very closely this way, and James lost this ability, seemingly without noticing how important it was. Wise fool and mild monarch. And this allowed leaders to arise within Parliament easily and organically, something that had not happened before with Tudor parliaments. So here is an absolutely vital constitutional development growing out of a procedural tactic. I've mentioned James's trouble with common law as something new to him since Scotland had its own tradition. James's conception of absolute authority led him to declare that the king is the author and giver of strength to the law. Therefore, he should decide cases. And that's often an image we have in our minds of royalty, isn't it?
I'm picturing Daenerys Stormborn holding court in Game of Thrones. That image of deciding cases and dispensing justice defines a good monarch. She was a good queen in that part of Game of Thrones.
And that's how James saw it. The Chief Justice Cook, spelled like Coke, insisted cases could only be decided in a law court. And this was also an innovation, actually, but couched in the language of ancient precedent. And when James responded that cases are decided on reason, and others have reason. No, was the answer. Cases are not decided on natural reason, which you have overflowingly, my prince, but on artificial reason and judgment of law. And James claimed it was treason to assert that the king is under the law. So Cook said, this guy, an authority, Bracton, had said that the king should not be under man, but under both God and law. Now, that's a subtle move, but it didn't impress James, who raised his fists to strike Cook. Cook fell to the floor and begged for mercy. James never seemed to understand that an absolute monarch was not something that could fit into the new developing English society, its laws and customs. It never came to a head, since James was always willing to compromise. Now, compromise is the wrong word, but pull back from the brink of outright conflict and conciliate. And he was honest in his bargains. And with James, I think we have a man who claimed to be an absolute monarch, and defended the principle of absolute monarchy in theoretical terms, but possibly deep down was content not to be one in reality. The financial issue vis-a-vis Parliament would never really be solved. The government's basic argument was, vote for my money, and then we can discuss your grievances. And Parliament insisted on redress of grievances first, then we'll talk money. So James would threaten them, and then conciliate them. Parliament was above all concerned with lavish spending and corruption at court. And Wentworth, during his parliamentary days, summed it well with this quote: "To what purpose is it to draw a silver stream into the royal cistern, if it is daily drained from private cocks?" Unquote. In 1610, James got Common and Lords together and told them, quote, "The estate of monarchy is the supremest thing on earth, for kings are not only the lieutenants of God upon earth, and sit on God's throne, but even by God himself they are called gods. Kings exercise a resemblance of divine power on earth. Kings can make or unmake their subjects. They have the power of raising and casting down, of life and death, judges over all their subjects, in all cases, and yet accountable to none but God only." And this made many in Parliament nervous, and there were many cautious expressions of this nervousness, always cautious. And the expressions were cautious because anything they said against the king could be reported, and that could result in a treason trial. And when I think about that, and how people had to self-censor their thoughts, it makes me wonder if it was even easy to think about opposing the king when you can't say anything. How badly do limits on speech inhibit thinking? And yet, despite his words, he never did behave like an absolute monarch. I mean, with only rare exceptions, he stayed within the law and was neither arbitrary nor erratic in exercise of power, unlike his spending and unlike his successor Charles. What Parliament could do, though, was speak and act against those close to James. They could complain about favorites and ministers and plan to impeach them. But this infuriated James. He called Parliament a rotten reed of Egypt and berated Robert Cecil for thinking he could draw honey out of gall. It's a nice phrase, draw honey out of gall. He dissolved Parliament in 1611 before they could impeach anyone close to him and before they'd voted any money for him. And so that was about the time they started selling knighthoods and even titles of nobility for cash. We know James had a different attitude towards honors than Elizabeth. She only created 878 knights during her 40-year-plus reign, while James awarded over 900 in his first 4 months, even before they began selling the honors. One story is that he jokingly knighted a large piece of beef. "Arise, sirloin of beef!" So he lost that tool, honors and titles, a very subtle, powerful tool to bind men, families, and localities to him by overusing it. Once honors were for sale, they lost most of their magic. They stopped being honorable, stopped conferring genuine status. People started refusing them. So they awarded knighthoods and the like for a cost, even to people who did not want them. And then, you'll love this, fined those people for not accepting them and raising hundreds of thousands this way.
What? That's crazy. So you're saying you might get a message one day that says, congratulations, you're now a knight, please pay £1,000. And if you refuse, the fine is £5,000?
Yes, you're getting it. It's a farce, but in real life for high stakes. And they also sold off the rights to break some of the onerous regulations we'll talk about soon. Also selling pardons to people who had evaded obsolete laws, mainly, but selling pardons. And partly this was a consequence of the separate royal legal system. Star Chamber and other prerogative courts existed alongside church courts and common law courts. And remember, those royal courts did not have to take common law and precedents into account, because common law would have provided protection from a lot of this nonsense. I don't know if this is just by the way, but the last two burnings for heresy took place around this time in 1612. I mean, the last two legit, formally convicted burnings for heresy. One was a person espousing views like Giordano Bruno, that Christ was just this guy, just this guy, not God and man together. And the other, with the name of Bartholomew Legate, had similar ideas and also said he had not prayed to Jesus for 7 years. The king tried to kick him, saying, "Away, base fellow! It shall never be said that one stayed in my presence who has never prayed to our Savior for 7 years together." They burned him. And you do see the logical problems with that.
Yeah, no one could possibly know whether or not he prayed during those 7 years. They'd only have his word.
Many people could think this through, however, and in the future, men like Cromwell would insist on the primacy of individual conscience, and that no man may prosecute another for reasons of religious conscience. Anyway, James needed money still. The favorites I mentioned in episode 40 are expensive, and so he called another parliament in 1614, but this time he and his court tried to manage the elections to get people favorable to the court into office. It backfired big time. And all over the country, people were in a panic about rigged elections, and they returned to Parliament solidly against James. And this was an unruly Parliament that would hiss and boo anyone who spoke for the king. It refused to approve new taxes for the king, and in fact, not one single new bill received royal assent. It was known as the Addled Parliament. Dissolved after 3 months, and James threw 5 of them into the Tower after. The Lord Treasurer was Thomas Howard, brother of Francis, the Howards again, and he set about trying desperate things to raise money, like imposing a fine on any new building built within 7 miles of London.
This is starting to sound like random taxation.
Yeah, and as Attila the Bun says, random taxation is terribly destructive to investment and planning. Next, James got a few bishops and some friendly nobles to come down to the Tower and voluntarily donate some of their plate to the king. These would be silver or gold. He then said this was a great idea and that everyone should donate, so every county and borough send some money toot sweet. One man, though, refused to pay, Oliver St. John, spelled St. John, saying it was contrary to Magna Carta. So the king threw him into prison and fined him £5,000.
That's a strange new usage of the word donation.
It's easy for us to laugh at. James himself kicked off a great effort of combined diplomacy and financial expedient to sell his son Charles in the marriage market. This could potentially raise £1 million from the dowry. He was primarily marketed in France and Spain. In 1616, James got approximate control over the judiciary by getting them to agree to consult him over any cases involving the royal prerogative and dismissing Cook, who would not so promise. But in the process, he created a martyr to the cause of the rule of law and the liberties of the people. In 1617, James made the fateful move of promoting George Villiers, his lover, the Duke of Buckingham. the first non-royal to become a duke since 1572. The joke at the time was that he had royalty within, though. And this came with huge tracts of land and a huge income, but above all, he gave George a monopoly on patronage, so that everyone seeking office, read money, from the crown had to go through him. And by the way, about half the crown revenue was spent on paying office holders. And this, of course, was considered scandalous. Lucy Hutchinson, a Puritan, in her memoir wrote that Villiers had risen upon no merit but that of his beauty and prostitution. The next year, in 1618, the Dutch would have a consequential religious debate within the Dutch Reformed Church in Dort between a theologian named Arminius and the rest of the Calvinist clergy. Arminius argued against predestination in salvation, and James was very interested, and most of the churchmen in England followed this debate closely. Arminius argued against predestination in salvation. Arminius argued also that the Calvinists were too rigid, and they risked losing their religion by their blind devotion to their doctrine. This is like the argument I made in episode 34 that the severe view of predestination would bring atheism within the scope of mediocre minds. It just becomes too easy to blame God for everything, and that's the first step in rejection. I feel this is underappreciated even today. Mediocrity is too powerful a force to ever overcome. Milton's efforts to rescue God were too complex, and he made Lucifer the most interesting being in the world. I feel this is also underappreciated even today. And Arminius lost the debate and had to flee along with thousands of followers. But you can't get rid of ideas that easily. A new division appeared within Protestantism, a disagreement over predestination that would soon be fought out in England. 1619 was the year the banqueting house was completed. It was thought to be a fit place to receive the Spanish Infanta as Charles's bride. And here I'll break from the narrative to a little travelogue. The banqueting house is right in central London, easy to visit. It's near St. James, the Churchill War Rooms, the Horse Guards Parade, Trafalgar Square. And when you're hot and tired and footsore, the banqueting house is a perfect place. A cool place, even in summer, to rest and mellow under the influence of great art. It's never been crowded when I'm there, and I love to lie on the floor on soft cushions and gaze up at the Rubens murals on the ceiling. And I just love being in the place where Charles I was beheaded in January 1649. So many associations. Did Oliver Cromwell giggle? It puts me in a great mood.
Don't know if you remember this at all, but my first visit there was with you.
I remember it well. It was my first time there, too. In 1620, James made one of the classic diplomatic blunders I mentioned before, and pay attention because this happens quite a bit in history. The blunder takes this form. When potentially aggressive power A, contemplating war with minor country B, asks power C if C would keep the peace with A. And C says, yes, we would never go to war with you, A. So A interprets this as the green light to go invade B. And C, not understanding the subtext in A's original question, now is in a dilemma. And when the Spanish ambassador with the awesome name of Gondomar questioned James about his intentions with Charles and the Infanta, James said, I only want to marry my son to your master's daughter, and no other, and Spain is the only alliance I want. Gondomar then tells Philip III to go ahead and invade the Palatinate, and this puts James in a pickle with all the patriotic Puritans. Also, his ordinary honor is at stake since his daughter is electress there. And he accuses the Spanish of double-dealing, and Gondomar says, but we never said we would not invade the Palatinate. And James, starring in the role of C, now bursts into tears as he finally gets it. The Puritans blame James for this, which is interesting. It seems like another cognitive error, though. It may not have a name, but it involves placing too much responsibility on your own country for anything that happens elsewhere. I mean, obviously the Spanish are the aggressors, but Frederick did try to play in the Habsburg front yard in Bohemia, and James could have prepared for war 10 years earlier if he'd been more clairvoyant and therefore able to have some weight in European matters, but as it stood, England was terribly unprepared for war.
In my opinion, many modern Americans fall prey to that fallacy as well.
And this was also the year the Mayflower sailed for Plymouth in New England. The colonies would grow slowly at first, but would eventually be an important part of the miracle. The 1621 Parliament, the one I just mentioned, voted unanimously for war with the Catholic powers, but that James quickly adjourned, was one where the skirmishes over Parliament rights and king's prerogatives turned into a serious clash. Some historians have seen this Parliament as the beginning of the end for the Stuart kings. When they reassembled in November, they were still for war with Spain, and James responded by sending them a letter reading, quote, "He was very free and able to punish any man's misdemeanors in Parliament, as well during their sitting as after," unquote. He had effectively denied them any rights at all. And maybe James was still dealing with Scottish mafia types in his mind, but this went over like a lead balloon.
That does sound ominous, especially if he gets to decide what any man's misdemeanors mean. I'm actually starting to see the problem. All the things you talked about that seemed like farce, the titles, the donations, the palatinate, and then the threats, but the threats aren't funny at all.
Being threatened like that causes a change. You have to take it at least half seriously.
It's more than that, though. Some awesome king threatens you, that's one thing, you just submit humbly. But if the king is sort of a joke or a fool, that would feel different, unsettling or unjust or something.
Yeah, and they notice things like free speech is impossible when threats to your life are made. They sent petitions to James urging him to guarantee their rights, and frustrated, James dissolved Parliament. He put John Pym under house arrest through 2 other prominent members in the Tower. Pamphlet evidence isn't the greatest evidence for what people actually believed, but there were plenty out there discussing the James and Buchanan relationship, the James and Spain relationship, and the betrayal of the Protestant cause in both Germany and England. And James was really promising all kinds of tolerance for Catholics in his negotiations with Spain for the Infanta. And when we keep in mind the politics of this whole thing, the majority of the anti-Spanish pamphlets were printed in the United Provinces by the Dutch. Big surprise. Preachers started to speak out against James publicly, and preachers were arrested for it, to the extent that Buckingham even boasted of it. Spain got a new king, Philip IV, in 1621, and negotiations for a royal marriage were pressed even harder. Catholic recusants were released from prison, and this royal marriage would once again tie the British and Spanish crowns together, as in the days of Mary and Philip II, and bring peace and prosperity to the world. It was a deeply unpopular vision in England, and more farce. The Spanish court was no longer really interested in an English marriage, and the Infanta declared she would rather die than marry a heathen. She would rather die. In other words, England would have to give Spain the sun and the moon in exchange for the Infanta.
Like the frost giant stonemason who built the walls around Asgard.
Yeah, and the gods broke their word and undermined the basis on which their world existed. There was also farce in that story.
Loki was the mother of Odin's horse.
Yeah, that has many meanings, and we won't touch them here. Charles and George Villiers, the Duke of Buckingham, eventually traveled in person to Madrid to press their suit, incognito, with only 2 attendants, as a grand romantic gesture in 1623. Great power politics and grand romantic gestures. They pretended to be ordinary gentlemen. They wore false beards and traveled as Tom and John Smith, but they seemed to have no idea how to be ordinary people. They gave a boatman a gold piece without asking for change. So the boatman got suspicious and reported them to the magistrates, and in Canterbury, they were taken as suspected assassins. I mean, who are these weirdos walking around with false beards? Yeah, so they got arrested. They had to take off their beards and reveal themselves to the mayor.
You're making this up, right? Charles is the heir to the throne at this point, and Buckingham is a major government official? This sounds like a bad comedy.
No, it really happened. They eventually got to Madrid by horse via Paris. About 3 weeks of hard riding. Their arrival was a complete surprise to the Spanish. The Spanish were just amused. They were beside themselves by the fact that they now had the Prince of Wales in their control. They joked considerably about what they might do to him, what they might stick in him. And the Spanish, who knew what Buckingham was, were utterly contemptuous of him. Buckingham was shocked to be treated this way. Charles was frequently pressed to convert to Catholicism. We're fairly sure he never did, but there were occasional slurs ever after that he did convert. But it did seem reasonable to the Spanish that Charles actually intended to change religion. Why else was he there? They had made it very clear the Infanta would only marry a Catholic. And when Charles was allowed to greet the Infanta, he made the mistake of declaring affection for her, a serious no-no in a court that maintained strict rules of behavior. Violating protocol, shocking. The ridiculousness of it was that the heir to the English throne put himself in Spanish hands, and neither court was sure they would let him go. They might just hold him hostage. The actual negotiations soon got too complicated for Charles and Buckingham to understand, and they began to lose the thread. They were two youngish men without senior diplomatic assistants. It seems like the Spanish realized it and despised them for it. One part of it was, Charles and the Infanta could marry, but all laws against Catholics in England must be relaxed. The Infanta would remain in Spain for 6 months, her virginity as a security for English promises of liberty to Catholics. Charles actually agreed to this at one point.
Maybe he was getting scared.
And when James was asked to agree, he did so, definitely in fear that if he did not, he would never see his son and heir again, not to mention the man he loved. However, he knew full well that Parliament would never, ever allow him to keep his bargain. And Charles and Philip actually signed a marriage contract, but the terms were never fulfilled. The Spanish treated them like fools, but it took Charles several weeks to get that he was the joke. When finally they did return, Buckingham came back full of fury at the Spanish for how he was treated and was ready to throw out the peace policy and go to war with Spain. And the Spanish, for their part, demanded that James execute Buckingham. No love lost there. Now, it's a great triviality to change a peace policy into a war policy because of a personal insult. Buckingham could strut about complaining of his offended honor, but let's also note that he was appointed Lord Admiral, and that gave him the right to 10% of the value of all legal Spanish prizes in the event of war with Spain.
I remember the pirate episodes. They took millions worth of Spanish prizes, and Buckingham would get a 10% cut of that if there was a war. No wonder he was for war.
Yeah, given the last war, it's quite reasonable to think this could be worth 100 to 200,000 pounds to him personally. And this is more than the annual revenue of many governments at the time in Germany. How big a part are we supposed to think that this played in his decision for war? And Charles and Buckingham now pressed for war hard, and James was sick a year from death, and he receded into the background. The Lord Treasurer was still against war with Spain. They were in debt to their servants in England. How the hell could they afford to raise an army? No problem. Parliament impeached him for standing in the way. In 1624, Parliament voted money for a war with Spain, and that was that. A long peace policy tossed out because of a personal affront or a money-making opportunity or both. But this was popular with Parliament, and now Charles and Buckingham were running the government, so that when James died in 1625, it didn't really make a difference at first. But note that Parliament voted £300,000 for the war when the Crown thought $1 million would be barely enough. And now that war with Spain was on the menu, they needed a French princess for Charles. And they quickly got Louis XIII's sister, Henrietta Maria, a Catholic. Next week, we'll take a deeper look into Stuart rule after conversations with Cammie. And thanks, Nightrider. I appreciate you coming on the program.
Okay, we'll figure it out.
All right, Cammie, it's Boxing Day, Feast of St. Stephen. In Norway, they call it Andre Juledag. And we're doing a podcast.
Mm-hmm.
You've just heard Nightrider, more narrative history about the Stuart kings. What'd you think?
I really enjoyed the stories of Charles and Buckingham riding off on their grand romantic gesture, taking a pretty dangerous, I would think in some ways, ride. Insanely dangerous. Ooh. Going to Madrid, overland via Paris, incognito with fake beards, and their big mistake of leaving too large a tip, which uncovers who they are.
It's actually the heir to the throne, the Prince of Wales, and the head of government, and they're off with basically no escorts. They've got one attendant apiece.
But what I didn't catch in the end is what happened to Infanta.
Yeah, she did all right, I guess. She ended up marrying one of her cousins, Ferdinand, who ended up Holy Roman Empress, Queen of Hungary, Queen of Bohemia.
Well, Charles went on to marry
the
Henrietta,
sister of the King of France.
He went on to marry Henrietta, correct?
Yep.
Your statement that it became too easy to blame God for everything.
Yeah, I think that's a really important thing.
It seems so telling.
When you really take predestination very seriously and you don't think of it in terms of broad possibilities, because, something can be predestined and yet there could be, simultaneously several hundred universes going on and all these different things are happening in all of them. And perhaps all experiences are necessary. But terrible things like buildings burning down and children randomly dying are that way because God wants them to be. So it's very easy to blame God for evil. And people like Milton and Spencer, the great poets of the time, were very aware that ideas of predestination would lead people to notions like God is the author of evil, and that would cause people with a certain mindset some despair, and people who don't really think about it hard would, therefore be led to blame God and be led to reject God.
Well, it seems to me like it takes away some of the personal responsibility for oneself and one's family to blame everything on God, even if you did have control of, you did something wrong and it was God made me do it.
Yeah, there are a lot of problems with predestination, that's for sure. Some cultures with predestination become, quite passive, very quietist, very accepting. It might have a common saying like, if God wills it, or God willing. If others take seriously the idea that, say, your status with God is visible on earth now, then what do you start doing as a signaling social monkey is signal that God has saved you and you're going to heaven, as opposed to anybody else. So you can have high status. And that was mostly the European Calvinist approach, that somehow your status as a member of the elect or not was a kind of a visible thing on earth. And so people took the doctrine of a calling very seriously as a social signaling thing to, you kind of wanted to let everyone know that you were going to heaven. And so you have several generations of behavioral changes of people working really hard and working with a lot of dedication in their chosen fields, and also not being so big on consumption. So almost as if someone should research this, like, does one form of social signaling displace other forms? Because, consumption to show that, you have good taste, or you have money, or you're just cool. So you wear the fancy new Italian fashions. But the Puritans, instead, the people believing in predestination, weren't doing that kind of signaling. Instead, they were doing these actions in the world where they're contributing, which is proof of their status as elect people who are going to heaven. And that's gigantically, hugely, immensely pro-social. That's going to benefit in your whole society. Everyone goes around showing how wonderful they are, how dedicated they are to their professions, how much help they can give the community, what good things they could do for poor children, for widows and orphans, and to have that sort of instantiated in religion for several decades. It's kind of makes me wonder, was that the secret sauce that England had among the many possible candidates? And it's interesting because these kind of people would be very annoying to everybody else. So they were suppressed in the vast majority of Europe.
Annoying to everyone else.
Yeah, because they're signaling that they're better than you are.
Yeah. A higher, superior thing.
Yep.
Your descriptions of how King James raised money quite intriguing. Selling titles of nobility and giving them an expecting payment even if someone didn't want that.
Yeah, after a few decades, the thing that was more successful, because people refused the titles, basically, it started to become a mark of honor to say no. And so then the thing that was more successful, that actually raised the most money, was fining people for refusing their titles. And they created new titles. So the title of baronet, for example, didn't exist before. That was invented, I think, by James, but it was invented at this time as a higher, something greater than a knight that you could pay more for.
Interesting. It does remind me a little bit. I mean, we're here the day after Christmas, and it reminds me of the ads I kept getting about now you can purchase the title of landowner in Scotland, become a lord or lady.
Oh, yeah.
$49.95. You can own 1 square foot, and they'll send you a certificate, and you can take the title of lord or lady. So I was just an intriguing thought you shared. How badly do limits on speech limit our thinking? And that struck me in a lot of ways, that by limiting what we're allowed to express, are we also limiting our thoughts? Not expecting an answer to this, just an interesting to think about.
Yeah, I think it really is. I would like to know if that's been studied. Certainly, some of the great historians like Christopher Hill think that the English up to the 1640s had what he called a stop in the mind. Like stop, S-T-O-P, and mind, M-I-N-D. I remember talking about this with someone the other day, and they thought I was talking about a stop in the mind, like a mine shaft. But yeah, that people just couldn't think about sovereignty existing anywhere outside of a king. It just wasn't an idea. And that would be a very self-protective thing to think, right? That keeps you from having your head cut off. So I don't know. I think it's a really good question, too.
Well, I guess you could take it one step further in thinking, do limits on the words we have to express ourselves limit our thinking as well?
Of course, I think modern censorship is really weird because the words we're allowed to say keep changing, and they change pretty fast, and that keeps us constantly aware of it. I think probably the most effective form of self-censorship is that are happening when you don't even know it. But if you're constantly being, given a new word you can't say, then it's always in your face that you're censoring. So, and you are thinking, you're noticing that. I don't know.
Neither do I. Like I said, just some food for thought.
Okay, good. Thanks for coming on the program.
You're welcome.
See you next week.
Well, I hope so.
Thank you for the kind comments. I really appreciate that.